As the war in Ukraine rages on and Donald Trump prepares to take over the White House again, the threat to the rest of Europe from Russia is growing. For the Europe Conversation, I catch up with NATO expert on innovation, cyber and hybrid threats, James Appathurai, who says we're in uncharted territory.
James, look, across Europe we're hearing reports about much more increased sabotage, Russian sabotage against European countries. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and whether it's been on the increase?
So, absolutely. First thing to say is the sabotage comes on top of everything else that we've seen. So, cyber attacks, disinformation, political interference, forced migration, GPS jamming. So that's the baseline. And all of it higher than it used to be. What's new is an increased Russian appetite for and campaign of sabotage. That means arson, derailing trains, attacks on politicians' properties, attempts to assassinate, for example, the head of Rheinmetall, so industry leaders. So we see more of it, and we see a much higher appetite for deaths and massive damage in our countries.
And how are we detecting these? Because even you mentioned there the potential assassination of the German weapons manufacturer. How do these get found out, and how do then they get interrupted?
So basically it's intelligence services that are doing their work. But it's a really good question, because what we don't want to do is play whack-a-mole in one country. Oh, look, I see something over here, I react to that. Oh, look, I see something over there, I react to that. So what we're doing is putting together patterns and trends. So if there's one derailment of a train in one country that is used to take supplies to Ukraine, that's an incident. If we see 7 in 7 countries, that's a pattern, and we know who's behind it. So on the one hand, we're stepping up our intelligence activities. On the other hand, we're aggregating information and putting together the patterns and trends. And then we choose what to make public and what not to make public.
And how do we know this is definitely coming from Russia? Is it coming just from Russia? Is it China as well? But also, how do we know the source?
So we're very, very focused on ensuring that the information that we have is accurate. So when it comes to one incident, for example, the Rheinmetall incident, the intelligence services are confident enough that our politicians can go out in public and say it. But as I said, we need the patterns and we need the trends, because what we call hybrid or gray zone attacks are predicated on ambiguity. What the Russians or others are trying to do is make it not so clear it's them. So it's hard to attribute, therefore it's hard to act. So we need to intensify, and we are intensifying our intelligence and other efforts to be able to detect it and be more confident.
So just give an example of how the Russians are acting to turn the populations of member states away from support from Ukraine. You're talking about a big attack, an energy source, where civilians will get scared and say, well, look, if we just back off from our support from Ukraine, Russia won't target us. Is that what you're saying? Or just give us an example of how this works and what the Russians want the impact to be.
So what's important to know about the way Russians have always acted in the last century, Soviet times and now, is that they use all tools to achieve a cognitive effect. It's to change your mind. That's the way they look at things. And therefore, all tools can be used, including a nuclear threat very early. And we've heard this now dozens and dozens of times from the Russians. So they will have a disinformation campaign to say, because of your support for this war, energy prices are up. Because of your support for this war, food prices are up. And then they introduce through the sabotage, because of your support for this war, well, you're not safe. Things can happen here. And if you're an industry leader, you might not be safe. And I've gotten calls from the top level officials from other companies saying, am I also at risk? So it has an effect. And we need to ensure that, of course, our populations are safe. We're doing that. But second, to respond to the attempt to create this disquiet.
And you mentioned there whack-a-mole, because that appears to be a little bit of what's happening, because the threats or the attacks are more frequent.
Yes, I think we were in a position of whack-a-mole. I think we're better now at both building resilience in our cyber infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and in sort of managing potential escalation and in putting together all the pieces into a coherent puzzle. Are we doing as well as we should? No, because, as I say, the Russian risk appetite is going up. The activities that they're carrying out are getting a little bit more dangerous and certainly more frequent. So I can assure you our political leaders are aware of it, focused on it, and we are looking at steps to take to establish better deterrence and manage escalation.
What kind of deterrence?
Well, you might remember, for example, President Biden spoke to President Putin a few years ago, and he said, this critical infrastructure is off limits. If you cross this line, there will be real consequences. The Russians backed away. So you can establish areas where this is too far, and then make it clear that there will be a response, make it clear what the response might be, and the Russians do back away when they meet steel.
Because you mentioned their critical infrastructure and this threat by President Biden, because 99% of the world's data is transmitted through the subsea cables. What is the threat to those?
So you're quite right to say 90% of the world's data, but to put it into a more concrete term that people, I think, might feel a little bit more, every day, $10 trillion worth of economic activity goes through those cables, and across the Atlantic, so from Ireland, principally, in the UK, over in France a little bit, over to the US and back, it's $4 trillion a day. So the impact of those cables being cut is not nothing, particularly for economic activity. The Russians are continuing to carry out a program they have had for decades. It's called the Russian Undersea Research Program, which is a euphemism for a paramilitary structure, very well funded, that is mapping out all of our cables and our energy pipelines. And it has so-called research ships. They have little submarines underneath. They have unmanned or uncrewed, remotely operated vehicles. They have divers and explosives. So we all know this. Anyone can Google it and you can see it. So they're, I think, the most active threat to our infrastructure. You might have seen that a Chinese ship cut the Baltic Connector cable. The Chinese have come forward to admit that. In the context of the No Limits Russia-China partnership, we always have to look at these with, I think, a little bit of concern, incidents like this. But I think the Russians are most clearly the threat.
Just disinformation, because obviously that's your area of expertise as well. We've seen since Elon Musk took over Twitter that there's been a much stronger rise in hate crime, and itself Twitter is no longer as regulated as it was for things like hate crime, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and so on. Is it a concern now that he is so close to the new White House?
I think all NATO governments have expressed really profound concern about disinformation. And what we've seen in the US election and in all of our elections now is a lot of disinformation, including using social media platforms. It's not just across the Atlantic, it's around the world. And all our populations are very vulnerable to it. So we are looking at disinformation, including on social media platforms, as part of this whole deck of cards that adversaries and strategic competitors are using against us. So, of course, it's up to national governments, up to the EU, to decide how they regulate these.
Because we're hearing that J.D. Vance is saying that, Europe or the US will remove support for Ukraine through NATO if the EU continues to regulate Twitter or X.
Yes, well, I mean, I saw that, and they haven't taken office yet, so I think they were a little bit in campaign mode still. But what I would say is this. Support for Ukraine is almost existential for European security. It is absolutely crucial for Euro-Atlantic security. And NATO, of course, is the essential pillar for defending the Euro-Atlantic area. So we're quite confident, based on everything we've heard, that the U.S. support for NATO will continue.
Just finally, on generative AI, because that's an area of your expertise as well. And I wanted to ask you that in relation to disinformation, because that is transforming disinformation.
It is, and I could go on at length about this, but I'll say maybe three things. One is generative AI itself is very quickly creating deepfakes that even the companies that make it can't detect. Second, it is posing a big risk to large parts of the world that were not watching English or French or German language, Chinese language, video and audio, and haven't actually over time built up the same understanding of the potential for disinformation and deepfakes that other societies that basically use widely used languages have. So a lot of communities around the world are suddenly being exposed to perfect fakes in their dialect, and they are not used to it. So they're very, very exposed to disinformation. I think the third thing which interests me a lot is we called in a number of tech firms and we asked them what the future looked like. What they said was that within 4 years, 90% of what's on the internet will be fake, will be false. 70% of what's being produced for the internet now is being produced by AI. So all of this is now going to be what we see, and it's going to be very difficult to tell what's true and what's not true. And then the final point is, if you look at what happened, for example, after the storms in the US, a number of false images were created, and politicians posted them. But when they were told that they were fake, they said, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's making a point that I want to make. So to a certain extent, we've already reached a point where we're post-truth because of AI, because they know it's fake, but they don't care. So we have interesting waters ahead of us.
We do indeed. Well, James Appathurai, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you.